Hello and welcome to this guest talk that we have for Unit 2 on the politics of the global refugee regime. Our guest speaker today is someone who all of you have already met from the earlier videos, the introductory videos in this course, and I'm really delighted that our guest speaker in this video is Osama Salem. Um, Osama is someone who, as they say, needs no introduction, but I'll introduce all the same. As you've heard in the introductory video, that Osama is originally from Syria and has had two different lived experiences of displacement. And it's these two lived experiences of displacement which have made him so passionate and committed to the field of refugee protection, but also on questions of advocacy. But Osama brings to this work his educational background in the social sciences and in political science and refugee law, from the University of Southern Denmark, from the European University in Flensburg in Germany, and Leuven University in Belgium. He's also completed a series of different major trainings on protection with the Protection Learning Program with the Division of International Protection at UNHCR. So Osama brings that his own experience, his training, and his experience, but he's also been at the forefront as a practitioner, responding to many mass movements of people with different organizations, having worked with UNHCR, IOM, the International Organization for Migration, OCHA, the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and some international NGOs as well. He's worked in fields of registration, protection, repatriation, capacity building, and reception in different regions in different countries. So Osama brings tremendous experience from that. But in our conversation today, we really want to focus on his experience from 2017 as being one of the founders of the NRV, the Network for Refugee Voices. And the NRV played a major role in two initiatives. The first is helping to lay the foundation for the current landscape on advocacy and refugee participation in the negotiation of the Global Compact on Refugees, and that paragraph 34 of the Global Compact on Refugees, which says that responses are most effective when they meaningfully involve those they're intended to protect and assist. He was also on the steering committee that sought to achieve in June 2018 this first global summit, the Global Summit for Refugees, which brought together dozens of passionate refugee advocates with lived experience of displacement, from which we can trace many of the successes and many of the progress, examples of progress that we've seen on refugee participation in the world today. And currently, Osama is working on developing and conducting training in the fields of international refugee law, international protection, and advocacy, including this training program for our seats. So, Osama, let me begin by not only saying welcome, but saying thank you. Thank you for the real leadership, the visionary leadership that you have shown over the years in this field. And what, let me say for the record, what a great privilege it is for me to be collaborating with you on this field, in this area of training, and how much I've learned from you over the years. So, Osama, welcome to this guest talk, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. I'm really honored to be here. Hello, everybody, and hello from Berlin.
Thank you. So, Osama, I think what I want to do is as a first question with this unit that looks at the politics of the global refugee regime, and that these politics are something that you've really experienced firsthand and you've navigated firsthand in the process of the Global Compact for Refugees, Global Compact on Refugees, the Global Refugee Summit. And so my first question is really if you can talk a little bit more about the experience that you've had in engaging with the politics of the global refugee regime. What's been your experience in engaging with and navigating these politics?
Thank you, James. I think the experience, maybe like anyone else, in that time was new to me. So maybe just to put you in the situation, I received a call in March 2017 from a friend saying there's a group of refugees that want to meet in Brussels but they have no idea what they want. That was, but maybe there's something we need to do because of the New York summit. And I thought, okay, let's go there. I mean, let's see. And we met. We were 16 people, refugees, in the beginning mainly from Syria. And in that room, we were bringing up all the talks about the global compact and the New York summit. And there was a vast majority of consensus of that room that there's something needs to be done for refugees, but not only refugees from Syria, but refugees from all over the world. So we took it to ourselves to start networking, start navigating the politics, engaging with politicians, and put ourselves really in the full front of the discussion. And most importantly, we wanted to engage refugees and people with lived experience from all over the world, not so just to not to have a overwhelming majority of Syrians in that group. The experience was extremely rewarding as such, but it was really full of obstacles and challenges. First of all, we were not all the same level of knowledge of the global refugee regime, our experiences, language skills, and so on. But what was really challenging was to, when we would stand next to an ambassador of a country, maybe a lot of us didn't know what to say, because in some cases we were prepared, in other cases we were not prepared. But we learned this. We learned how to prepare. We learned how to read about the background of the meeting. What do we want? What are our points? We prepare everything in advance, and we started navigating also other opportunities, other factors of the refugee world, such as the private sector, for instance, and so on. Not to make the answer too long, I think based on this experience, we really came a long way, and we achieved a lot of things, and there are other things we wish to achieve, but we didn't. But I think when we read between the lines, and that's my experience, I think the biggest achievement we had was the network. That room, James, when we were in Geneva, the last day of the forum, when we met all the refugee leaders from all over the world, I think I was standing there in the corner of the room looking, I'm saying, that's the point. It's not the document that we will produce in the end. That's the point. And then months later, a year later, we see this is coming to the reality, because that room had a lot of people that today create networks, organizations, and today they make a difference.
No, and that's a really powerful image, that it's the individuals that occupy these spaces, and what motivates this training is the capacity of those individuals to operate in this world of politics, where you have powerful actors and institutions that have their own interests within the regime. But it raises the question, from your experience, and having, on the one hand, studied international refugee law, and then practiced international refugee law, you know better than anyone that the regime itself was mandated to ensure protection for refugees and to find durable solutions for refugees, but that these mandates of the regime are so often conditioned or influenced or circumvented based on the politics, based on the interests of these actors within the regime itself, these powerful actors within the regime. And I'd like to know, like, from your perspective, what does this tell us about the reliability of the regime? Given that the regime is conditioned by politics, and that powerful actors have such a significant influence on the outcomes of the regime, what does that tell us about how much we can rely on the regime itself?
Thank you, James, for the question. I think it's very complex. So I think there are many layers there. So regimes, as you know, and legal tools are created out of need and response to something. However, the sad part of that truth is that states and the powerful actors behind that often change the end result of these tools towards their own interest. And I always took the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as an example because basically because when I want to examine the influence and the evolution of such tools, I think the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a good example because it came in a time with the neo anti-colonial movements when a lot of nation states were created and emerged. And based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we can dissect and see how it evolved. And based on that, we can see how other tools evolve, for instance. So just to give an example, of Article 14, paragraph 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights reads as follows. So everyone has the right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution, end of quote. One could conclude that there is a universal right of asylum that is a subjective right for persons fleeing one state and entering another state. However, this is not the case because, first of all, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is non-binding document. And the second reason is it does not enshrine the right of entry to a third country. So it merely provides the right to seek and enjoy asylum, but in other countries. So to enjoy this right in other countries, we need to enter that country, but that is not a right. Which brings us to the second point, which is the right for any person to leave a country, including their own, is actually enshrined in many different protection tools. So in the ICCPR, so the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, in the fourth protocol of the European Convention of Human Rights, and in the African Charter of Human People and People's Rights. So there is here a paradoxical gap, which is the law, the international law, gives us the right to leave our home country, and it allows us or gives us the right to return to our countries, but it does not allow us or does not give us the right to enter another country. So how is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a non-binding document, gives us the right to asylum? And then we talk about protection. What is protection? Where can we find the protection definition? And a lot of people come and ask me, what's protection? So protection was never defined by any state. Why? Why didn't they define protection? Is it because they didn't want to confine themselves to certain rights, or is it because they wanted to stay open and include more rights? But the truth is, protection was defined by the Interagency Standing Committee, which was defined as all activities that aim at the full respect of the individual in the letter of and spirit of the relevant bodies of law, in this case, the International Refugee Law. And it leaves today a large scope of interpretation, of course, because when we create activities that aim at the respect and the rights of the individual, we can call that protection, which falls back to fulfill the aim and the goal of the international refugee regime. But the problem is also, in this case, this has good and bad side of it. So at one point, it gives us the space to create projects, activities, programs that we can call protection. And on the bad side, we cannot have states committed to this protection because it's not a right. Now, just to lean back a bit and talk about governments, states negotiate and agree on text that expresses their will, their political will, but without any commitment. One example is, just to mention this, is the negotiation again for Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which in the preparatory work back then, it provided refugees with, open quote, seek and receive asylum closing quote. But it was faced by a large objection from the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia. And this was changed to, open quote, seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution, closing quote. So they changed the terminology because states wanted to change the terminology. And it has been negotiated and they agreed finally on the last one. So it's because we can leave any country and we can have the right to return to that country, but we cannot have the right to stay and seek asylum in the country that we want. And the last point I want to mention here regarding this question is international law, regional agreements, domestic laws, UN resolutions, legal tools, you name it, are all governed by states. And no matter what, we will always follow states' interests in deciding and shaping these bodies of law. So, but we should never forget, and this is something I learned from my experience with NRV, we should never forget the people who write and stand behind these laws are very good at their job and very smart people. So never underestimate this. Of course, don't estimate yourselves, but we need to keep this in mind. The main question here is whether international refugee regime is reliable, because I think it's not in its current practice and the power balance. But I think the main question that we need to lean a bit on is whether we can leverage the available bodies of laws to serve the interest of refugees and guarantee their protection rights, which I think we could.
And I think, that, and it's so compelling the way that you framed it. I mean, just with that example of Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, how governments, Saudi Arabia and the UK, coming at it from very different perspectives, they bake politics into the very tools of the regime, right? That it's there from the moment that they're created, and you add on to that the nature of international law, that there are no enforcement mechanisms, or the enforcement mechanisms that we have are very, very weak, and the costs of non-compliance are very, very low, and so states get away with doing what states politically can justify, and can politically justify to their own voting publics, not necessarily to the international community. But within that, there's this notion of who the individuals are and what their interests are, and that we're not going to change the fact that politics is at the heart of the working of the regime. So it leads to the question then, and you sort of hinted at this, if we recognize the central role that politics plays, how can a deeper understanding of politics help us influence outcomes within the regime? Like how do we, take politics and sort of turn it back as a force for more progressive action within the regime? How can we use an understanding of politics to really enhance refugee advocacy and outcomes for refugees?
Yeah, so it's simple. I think, I mean, it's not simple how to do it. It's simple whether this is something very important that we need to understand before going into advocacy. It's because if anybody goes to a football game or a basketball game or any place, whether it's a player, a referee, a spectator, a sideline referee, or whatever, they usually need to understand the rules of the game. So for example, just to put it in practice here for the same topic, it is very important to get semantics right of the law. Law is not simple language, it's complex. So there are two terms that are very similar when we hear them: the right of asylum and the right to asylum. And as you know, James, so they're different in meaning. The right of asylum is a state right. So it's a right of a state. This means that granting asylum is a matter of state sovereignty. And it's considered a peaceful and humanitarian act according to the Organization of the African Unity or the African Union. while the right to asylum is a right of a person, it's a right of an individual, which is it is important to understand it by analyzing several texts, of course. In the case of refugee regime, and precisely because states always put their own interest at the center, understanding the regime is really key to enhance refugee protection. So it's, I think, also part of my experience or our experience in advocacy before, it's more efficient to speak the same language as the politicians and the lawmakers are. It's also very recommended to understand the law and the semantics behind it before stepping in that room. And another example, just to make it more clear how it is. By the way, we have a thunderstorm and it's very loud, so I'm sorry for this. So the example is in 2015, in an early attempt of groups of activists in Germany who wanted to help advocating for refugee rights, they were publicly pointing out violations that are not relevant to refugee protection, and they were referring to, I'm gonna say between quotes now, Geneva Convention. And it turned out they were actually referring, when they were writing on social media, they were citing articles and sentences from one of the 4 Geneva Conventions and the 3 protocols that are relevant only to the international humanitarian law, or known as the law of the conflicts. And in this action, basically what I assume was happening, because we have the Geneva Convention, that is the Geneva Convention relating to the status of refugees, and that's the relevant one. And we have the Geneva Conventions that is for armed conflicts. And probably they Googled it and they started using something. And this action really hurt refugees a lot in Germany. This kind of advocacy usually hurts the landscape of the advocacy itself. So I would say understanding the politics and the refugee regime is not a luxury, it's a responsibility.
And that raises such an important point, is that when we talk about politics, it isn't just the politics of interactions in meeting rooms in Geneva. Politics is in the language that we use and the political choices of the language that we use. And so politics is, in a very sort of, critical Foucauldian kind of sense, like every practice that we engage in, whether it's a social media post, a tweet, something on Facebook, something on Instagram, whether it's the way that we engage with meetings, politics really is present in all of these actions. So to think of all of the acts that we undertake as being engaging with politics, which leads to the final question. I think your answer has been very, very compelling in the not just the need to understand politics, but the value, right? That it leads to better advocacy. That the more politically aware that we are about actors and their interests, raises the question, that we could then say, well, is it possible to think of a world or to think of a time where there are no politics? So, your journey has been, many, many years in engaging with this space and with these issues, and understanding politics, observing, witnessing politics, but also engaging with politics. How likely is it that politics, like the main structures of politics that we deal with today, distribution of power, the kinds of interests that we see, the power imbalance between states and individuals, how likely is it that those politics will change?
Yeah, it's I think the regime has been changing since its creation, and it will always change. Of course, the change sometimes is not too visible, because it's micro small changes all over the way, but it's very easy to track. So as we will see in some of the readings material that we have in this training, refugee participation and high-level advocacy were not a thing 20 years ago. But today we have special forums, we have meetings, we have And I think in the next few years, it will be completely unthinkable to actually work on something without involving refugees. Now, the form of involving refugees, that's another question. But I think now the politics cannot exclude refugees from working on politics. So I think this is where your role, I'm talking to the participants also, come in. So, but let's see a bit about the change that happened through maybe from recently. So let's look at this interesting development based on the climate displacement. So in a New Zealand case named Titiota from 2015, it concerns a person's claiming refugee status in New Zealand, and they left the island of Kiribati. Contrary to the common belief that everybody thought the New Zealand Supreme Court would reject the case, they actually ruled out with possible application of the Geneva Convention and the concept of persecution to environmental refugees, or they called it that. So what happened is in their ruling in paragraph 13, they actually wrote, I quote, "We note that both the tribunal and the High Court emphasized their decisions did not mean that environmental degradation resulting from climate change or other natural disasters could never create a pathway into the Refugee Convention or protracted person jurisdiction," end of quote. So it's they kept it open, and basically what they argued is at this moment the harm is not large enough to grant refugee status, but they left it open, meaning that in the future, when the harm of environmental degradation become big, it is possible to apply Geneva Convention. This is a change. This is a change not from a long time ago. If you talk to somebody 10 years ago about environmental displacement, whether they can apply Geneva Convention, they will tell you, no way. So this could be a change, a renewal, about the Geneva Convention. Our questioning of future changes of our examination of regional and international protection, both regarding the right to asylum through the principle of non-refoulement and with regard of the very notion of refugee and statutory protection, highlights really three main points here, in my opinion. So the 1951 Geneva Convention is and remains basically the cornerstone of refugee protection. The primary role of advocates here is first, so the point number one, to ensure compliance with the Geneva Convention through the correct, structured and evolving application. And this is really important point. It's the evolving application in the light of today's conditions. And the second point is to ensure, it's the role of the advocates to ensure the respect of regional protection tools that were developed as complementary to the Geneva Convention as subsidiary or temporary protection, and also to ensure to create such additional regional tools as well, because the Geneva Convention alone cannot function. It needs additional tools, mainly regional. And the third role is to recognize the limits of the law. And I think this is very important one, to recognize the limits of the law, its text, to understand its text and existing protection systems. In the long term, reforms will be necessary through new texts to adequately address, of course, issues related to environmental disaster, for example. In the long term, too, a reform of practices with an international system of decision-making and genuine solidarity based on distribution of refugees. We all know this. So the development will be, of course, slow, but very necessary. It will require debates, it will require advocacy and the political courage. So it's also very simple example here. I like to talk about examples because I think they are really powerful in proving what's happening in our world. Um, so before 1951, we did not have a refugee convention. And before 1967, the convention had geographical limitation to people coming from Europe as a result of the Second World War. We did not have protection mechanism for people fleeing generalized or indiscriminate violence and wars until we had the Cartagena Declaration. And then we had the extension of refugee definition under UNHCR's statute. We did not have subsidiary protection until 2014, granting people protection that they are still on the run and in need of protection. But today we do, because things change, because people worked on it, because we thought we need a change. So the international refugee regime has the ability to develop and to be enhanced. The only flaw, in my opinion, is timing, because the development usually happens after a catastrophe happens. We look and we think, oh, we should have done something here. Let's do it now. But it's often late, because we hurt people or people get hurt until this happens. So your role is to overcome this time limitation as advocates for solutions, to find solutions before they are already needed.
Yeah. No, that's a really powerful point on which to end, is the notion. And I loved in your answer there how, if we look at the current moment within the refugee regime, it looks like change is quite impossible. But if we look at the history from the 1950s through the 1960s, we see that it's a history of change, but change is very slow. But each of those moments of change have been in reaction to a missed opportunity, right? The whole premise of the United Nations Charter is never again, never again, because of what it is that we've just endured. So to change that cycle, to break that cycle of always responding as opposed to anticipating. But I want to end by really picking up on a word that you used about courage, about having political courage. And often when we think about, gaps or limitations or constraints, it's the need for political will to overcome those changes. And there's quite a bit of hopefulness that we can take away from your comments on this, Osama, about, that historically we have so many examples of political will. We have so many examples of change. And in each of those moments of change, they have been moments of politics. And so, while the politics of the day may change, the presence of politics is constant. And so understanding that politics and taking courage and learning lessons from historically what has enabled change in the past is the greatest guide for how change can be achieved in the future. So, Osama, thank you as always. I learned so much from hearing you. So thank you for your contributions, and thank you for your insights on this topic of the politics of the global refugee regime. I know that this lays a really strong foundation for the discussion following the lectures and the readings and the guest lecture videos. So thank you as always.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you everybody for listening.